Just want to welcome everyone here today to Strategy Session 3, Accountability-Based Flexibility for School Districts. And Dr. Paul Hill will be our moderator today. He is the founder of the Center on Reinventing Public Education. Without further ado, Dr. Paul Hill.
Well, I was warned that the introduction would be short, but wow. So this panel is coming to talk about a very interesting and not well enough known phenomenon that a lot of the reforms are the kind that Governor Bush just mentioned are coming together in particular places. In fact, in big cities with dire educational problems where the school system is being redefined as being a monopoly provider of all the schools to being the maker of a marketplace where people with new ideas can come in and serve students in imaginative ways. And Christine Campbell, my colleague, and I have given this phenomenon a name. We call it portfolio districts, and the metaphor is straightforward. The school district that instead of saying everything is ours, instead it says we hold a portfolio of different providers and different schools for different purposes and try to make the best set of options for the families in our community that's possible. And basically, the portfolio district idea, which you'll hear a lot about from the panelists, whom I'll introduce in a minute, has a lot of parts, and it varies place to place depending on circumstances, but there's some things in common. First of all, the city, whether it's the superintendent of schools or the mayor or some other state institution, takes a broad perspective on the school system and says, we know the schools have got to be different. We know that different needs require different approaches. We know we're not getting there at all with lots of students. We need to experiment. We need a strategy of differentiation rather than unanimity. We need to create good choices for all families. We need to be open to new ideas and new entrants. That is, people with ideas about how to run a better school, people with ideas about how to teach better. We need to be open, in fact, to the resources of a community where many of the educationally relevant ideas and people have been sidelined by the idea that the school system is a hermetically sealed bureaucracy. Instead, open it up and be open to not only ideas that are generated locally, but ideas that come nationally and internationally. Be open to charter schools, be open to hybrid and virtual schools. And then to create a level playing field so that the city is attractive to people with new ideas. People with new ideas know that if they come in and serve students effectively, they can get the same funding and the same chance to succeed as incumbent schools that used to belong to the district. And that implies that incumbent schools end up being put on the same performance basis as every other school. So every school's existence is performance contingent. If they work, they stay. If they don't, families will go someplace else, and the portfolio district will make sure that bad schools are closed and new ones are always coming in to create new alternatives. So it means that everybody has performance accountability, and that the city, whether under the leadership of the mayor or the state or the superintendent, tries to become a magnet for talent. It tries to become a place that people locally and nationally and internationally want to work because they know they can succeed, they know they can serve students, they know they can make a difference. And finally, the core idea of the portfolio strategy is that the best set of schools we can provide today, even if we open it up in the ways I've described, are probably not going to be good enough to serve all of our students well, and they certainly aren't going to be good enough to serve the needs of an expanding, more competitive economy. So at the core of a portfolio district is the idea of continuous improvement, that we need to get someplace we can't get by one jump. We have to go by many jumps. That means you're constantly pruning the portfolio. What parts of it are not succeeding, even if they were good enough yesterday, and what can we do to bring in new ideas so that at any time we say this is the best set of schools available for our students and our community that's possible, without respect to rules or anything else. Now, these are very important initiatives. The leadership comes from many different places. Sometimes it's local. In Denver, for example, the initiative for Denver's portfolio district came from Michael Bennett, now senator, and foundations and other people that are there. In New Orleans, it came from the state. We now see mayors who've taken it over and taken that on as their goal. We also see fascinating state-local collaborations where in Cleveland, for example, the African-American Democrat long-term lifetime mayor has made a pact with the Republican governor to create a whole new performance-based school system in Cleveland, which couldn't have happened without either the mayor's political juice or without the authority of state law that's changing the district. So these are ambitious activities. They meet a lot of resistance, and I will hear a little bit about that in a minute, but we can talk more about it. Resistance comes from almost everybody. It certainly requires changes in the collective bargaining agreement. Many districts self-consciously use chartering to create a supply of teachers who are not unionized. That creates competition for the union. It opens the whole system up. It means that almost everybody who has an ox in the old system gets gored in some sense or other. And that the fact that they complain doesn't mean you're not making progress, but it certainly is an issue. It requires a change in mindset among educators who realize that they need to be innovative and on a performance basis. And it requires the disestablishment of bureaucracies where all the money is locked up. If you want to build a level playing field for new ideas and new kinds of schools, every school has to have the same funding, and that's not really possible if some schools get the benefit of a bureaucratic oversight or publicly owned buildings and others don't. So you have to disestablish a lot, and it's very noisy. I do want to flog the fact that Christine Campbell and I have just written a book about 4 years' experience of this nationwide, and the Brookings Institution has printed the book but has served us well by not delivering it in time for this meeting, but we will be able to give you links to it if you're interested. So today, we're going to hear from 3 real-world practitioners, one kind of an old hand and 2 coming into it. The first is John White, who was a key portfolio district manager in New York City before moving to lead the Recovery School District in New Orleans, and is now the state superintendent in Louisiana. And it's funny to use the word pure and New Orleans in the same sentence, but that New Orleans is the purest portfolio district. It's centralized and the like. David Harris from Indianapolis is going to talk about a much more messy situation that's still a portfolio of a broad community with lots of school districts that are trying to find a way to rationalize their effort to improve all the schools. And Tyrone Winfrey from Detroit, from the Educational Achievement Authority in Michigan, is going to talk about the newest and probably the most challenged activity to turn around opportunities for children in a city that's been collapsing for a long time in Detroit. So without further ado, I'll turn to John White.
Thank you. And I do want to say, Paul, how much to you and Christine, we all, I think, on this stage owe you for your guidance and leadership on this issue, and I look forward to reading the book myself, so thank you. I would just start by saying that I think this all gets down to one very simple idea, and it's not so much about the standards to which we should hope that students learn. It's, in my view, very much government's role to set the standards by which to which we should hope all students are able to achieve. But the question of the very complex question of how then every young person in a given city or a given state is able to progress to that point, what sets of experiences a kid is able to have in order to get to that point, I do think we need to wrestle very, very deeply as, you know, all of us in this room, reformers. Where do you think the authority to make those millions of decisions in the lives of a child should rest? And I think if you look back at the history of education reform over the last 40 years, and if you look at the way that our system, well before that, has tended to be structured, with a paternalistic federal government with its multiple different offices and divisions, with 50 different states that have their reflections of that federal bureaucracy with their offices and their divisions, with 14,000 school boards across the country, each of which is run by a set of elected officials. And at every single juncture along that fragmented path of governance, collective bargaining units, lobbyists, advocates, vendors, and so on, exercising influence in the halls of legislatures and the back rooms of school board meetings and central offices in every school district in the country. It is an undeniable fact that decision-making authority in terms of the lives of children and how they reach those standards for learning has essentially been removed from the people who are closest to kids. And that this, in my view, represents the greatest threat to success in public education in our country. And so when we talk about a portfolio district, and certainly my colleagues may disagree with me on this, but I don't view it as one kind of dogmatic model, whether it's the New Orleans model or the Detroit model, the Indianapolis model, that we're here to implement. I think of it as a mode of policymaking that hopes and aspires to arrive at a point of decision-making on behalf of the child that empowers the most local of actor, which is the parent and the educator. Now, I'll talk a little bit later about how that certainly involves questions of what decisions, certainly involves questions of how talented are the people who are making those decisions, no question about it. It's not a total walking away from responsibility for those questions on the part of government. But it is to say that at the end of the day, in my view, we will only get to where we want to get if we have empowered the best people possible to make the best decisions possible on behalf of kids, and that will never be the central offices of a state agency or a school district. And until we realize that and enact the policies necessary to achieve that mode of policymaking, we will not be successful as reformers.
Well, great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'm humbled to be on the panel with this terrific group of people. And Paul, thank you for describing what's happening in Indianapolis as messy. I think that probably is an accurate description. And the work that we've been doing in Indianapolis has been long and hard, and the progress that we've made is discouraging sometimes when we look at the extraordinary things that are happening in New Orleans, but I'm excited to be here to talk about what we've learned and the process that we've gone down. Our work to really begin to redesign our public school system began probably in 2001 when the Indianapolis mayor became the first mayor in the United States to get direct chartering authority. So the ability to grant charters to open schools and the responsibility to oversee those schools. At that time, our district, largest district, the Indianapolis Public Schools, was in dire straits. According to one study, only 25% of African American males at that time were graduating from high school. Mayor Peterson, whom I worked for at the time and became the city's first charter schools director at that time, succeeded a mayor, Steve Goldsmith, who was a terrific mayor in many respects, but according to his own book, had more failed efforts in education reform than any mayor in the country. And Mayor Peterson thought that the direction that our public schools went indicated the direction that the city went. So he was looking to do something that was meaningful, that was a challenge to the status quo, but that was also something that was achievable and sustainable. Mayoral control of the school system did not seem like a feasible option given the makeup of the House of Representatives at the time. And he became very excited about the prospects of charter schools. Of course, he believed that from a policy perspective, they provided really promising opportunities for families. One, they created new options. They brought real competition into the public school system. They created the opportunity for innovation, but he also thought they were something that could be achieved and could be sustained, that you could build real community support around. Not to say that it was a slam dunk to get charter school legislation passed. It had failed the previous 6 years in the legislature. But I think he thought that he, as a Democratic mayor, could help break the logjam because the House Democrats had been the ones that had been preventing the legislation from passing. And I think that he, along with several other people, were able to do that. In 2001, he got the legislation, the legislation passed, and he became the first mayor in the country with chartering authority. And I think that mayors are uniquely well positioned to be charter school authorizers for many reasons, but I'll highlight two. One, mayors are directly accountable to the families served by the schools that they charter. And so that creates an incentive for them to be rigorous in both the upfront screening and the ongoing accountability. And I think one of the challenges that the charter sector has had nationwide and why we have more mixed results than we'd like is that we haven't had sufficient rigor coming from authorizers, both in terms of who gets to open a school and the ongoing accountability. And the other real advantage that we had, that having a mayor as an authorizer created, was it attracted the kind of people you want to get involved in that work. And I think one of the secrets to the success in Indianapolis is the caliber of the people in the organizations that have gotten involved in starting schools has been very, very high. And so the initiative, I think, was very successful. In 2006, we won Harvard's Innovations in American Government for the award. We're able to start 16 schools in the first 4 or 5 years. But the challenge we faced at that point, in terms of growing the charter sector, was a lack of human capital, which is an issue all across the country, but it's a particularly acute issue in cities like Indianapolis. I know Detroit faces those kinds of issues, cities all around the Midwest and the country. And so in 2006, we started the organization that I work for now, the Mind Trust, and our focus was how do we draw human capital, how do we draw talented people, especially entrepreneurial talent, to Indianapolis. And we initially started by creating a venture fund of about $5.5 million that we used to recruit some of the top national entrepreneurial education organizations to Indianapolis. And our first priority was to get Teach for America to Indianapolis, because if we didn't have that infusion of talent, we thought we were really limited in what we could do. We also created an incubator for emerging entrepreneurs who wanted to launch new initiatives. And one of the things that I think is an important lesson for all of us in education reform is when you create attractive opportunities for people to do meaningful work in education reform, you get a really huge response. People want to do this work. So we've awarded 7 incubator awards through that program out of an applicant pool of over 3,000 people from 48 states and 31 countries. So people from all over the United States and beyond have been competing for the opportunity to come to Indianapolis to launch new education ventures. And more recently, we launched a charter school incubator through which we invest $1 million in teams of people who want to start networks of charter schools in Indianapolis. And once again, we've gotten interest from all over the United States. And we felt like we really built the network of organizations that we needed to drive change. We had organizations that were recruiting great teachers into our city, preparing great school leaders, helping low-income kids navigate the college application process, using the summer months to close the achievement gap, creating great new schools through the Charter School Incubator, several different initiatives. And we were then really looking at scale. How do we scale these initiatives? And of course, the vast majority of the resources that are involved in public education are controlled by the school district, both financial resources and, very importantly, facilities. And so we thought if we're really going to accelerate the pace of change, really going to get to the point where we transform the overall system, we need to get access to the resources that are controlled by the school district. So we decided that we would come up with a plan for how to redesign the Indianapolis Public Schools as a way to spark a conversation in our community around what a public education system should look like. We released the plan in December of last year. It's 150 pages, so I will not go through it in any detail. But basically what we were wanting to do is what John described. We wanted to shift resources and authority from a central office down to the school level, really empower the people who are best positioned to make decisions that affect kids, give them the authority to make those decisions, the resources to do what they think can best meet the needs of kids, dramatically shrink the central office, and use the savings to make investments in bringing more great teachers and more great principals to our community, use dollars to incubate new schools so entrepreneurs could come to Indianapolis and launch new schools, shift control of the resources that the central office had down to the school level. And in so doing, we could almost double the per pupil allotment that each school got, from about $6,700 per kid to over $12,000 per kid. But to get that kind of reform enacted, we thought that we couldn't do it with an elected school board. We did not have a very good history in Indianapolis of the school board functioning at all in a positive way. So we recommended that the mayor get control of the school district. Turns out not very many other people thought that was such a good idea. And that has not really gotten traction. But here's the thing that's really interesting, and we don't know where this is going. We released the plan in December of last year. We had 4 of our 7 school board seats up for election this past November. And what ended up happening is the plan that we put on the table, at least if you believe what the newspapers reported, were a big part of the discussion in that school board election. And all of the candidates that supported the major elements of our plan, minus the mayoral control, none of them did that, but the other elements of our plan got elected, and got elected by huge margins. And I think there are a variety of factors for why that happened, but I do think that there's real power in presenting to the community a different vision for what a school system looks like. Nobody came back at all the public forums we did in our plan, nobody came back and said, you know, it's a really bad idea to shift resources and authority from the central office down to the school level. Nobody said we shouldn't invest in bringing more great teachers and more great principals here. Now, they disliked they didn't like the idea of mayoral control, and they had problems with the organization that presented the plan. But the actual ideas in it really resonate. And so as we have this conversation, I think we need to recognize that there's a lot of common sense in what we're talking about. And if we articulate this vision to the community, I think there's a lot of receptivity.
First of all, I want to say it's an honor to be part of this panel. And Dr. Hill and John White and David Harris, we in Detroit, in the state of Michigan, we actually stand on your shoulders so far as what we're doing with the Education Achievement Authority of Michigan. My role as Chief of Staff at the Education Achievement Authority of Michigan began last November. And prior to that, I served with the Detroit Board of Education, so I know what you're talking about regarding school boards. Also, I served at the University of Michigan. And can you imagine sitting on the school board for 6 years and going to commencement after commencement, graduation after graduation, watching students cross the stage or walk into an auditorium or a theater or whatever, and then eventually sit there on the stage and look in their eyes and wonder what they're going to do the next day, knowing that they've had difficulties in proficiency in math and writing and all types of things as they go out into the career world. Can you imagine standing on the stage and shaking their hands, and as they go across that stage, you talk to them and ask them what they're going to do in the future, and some of them have no plans. And you realize that as they cross that stage, if they don't have a plan for life, life is going to definitely give them one. Can you imagine serving at the University of Michigan for 14 years as a director and looking at application after application, transcript after transcript, ACT score after ACT score, SAT after SAT score, resume after resume, and looking at what are these students doing so far as sometime in the urban community, and wondering, as you compare their applications to 40,000 plus students from around the nation, you know, you see the disparity, the economic disparity in this nation, definitely attributed to the educational disparity. Now can you also imagine the Education Achievement Authority of Michigan? A school district was actually started back in November of 2011, and basically within a 9.5 to 10 month period, basically from scratch, from listening to, from going to New Orleans and listening to John White and going across this nation, looking at best practices, saying this is what we should do in our state. Here's a school district or a portfolio of schools based on student-centered individual learning, assessments to determine students' skill sets instead of their proficiency so far as grade levels. Also, here's a school system looking at how to group students by instructional levels instead of grade levels. Here's a school district looking at technology, making sure every student has access to a netbook or notebook, and making sure they have access to the state-of-the-art technology. Here's a school system based on principals being the CEO of their buildings, have the autonomy and the flexibility to hire their own staff members, to make sure that they are accountable for their budgets and being accountable for their schools overall. When you look at the Education Achievement Authority of Michigan, and you can follow along in your PowerPoints, in your packet, we basically started out with looking at establishing a strategic plan. That strategic plan was based off going around the nation, looking at other school districts, as well as going across the state of Michigan. We went to 8 different cities and had 11 different workshops, 4 of which were in the city of Detroit. We engaged community leaders, faith-based individuals, educational professionals, and so forth to say, what do you want to see in a school district? We had what are called community strategic conversations, where we basically talked to them about their core beliefs, what does 21st century education look like in terms of an animal or a place, which was very phenomenal because how people had to describe that. And then lastly, a mission statement for the Education Achievement Authority. What should that be? And talking to, in talks with my chancellor, Dr. John William Covington, he basically said, you know, we've talked to everybody else, but we have not talked to our clientele. So we did a 2-day, what we call Super Youth Leadership Summit held at Michigan State University, where we had 80+ students from around the state that came and also talked about what they saw in education. And we did a process called a weather forecast to say, what does your school district look like right now, and where do you want to see it to go in terms of a weather forecast? It was phenomenal. They also gave us information as to how we should brand the EA of Michigan as well. Next, we basically looked at our standard of operations procedures. How can our SOPs fit with this type of school district? Was very interesting as we spent and labored numerous days and nights and weekends to put together something that would take in consideration not a standard traditional school district, but a portfolio of schools that we had. We also looked at selection of the schools. In selecting the schools, we had to do a report card on every potential school that we would have in the Education Achievement Authority of Michigan. And with that report card, we looked at not only the demographics and the geographics of where the students were and what the composition of that student was, but we looked at the age of the building, the age of what it would take to maintain the building, the cost, and so forth and so on. But we also, which was very important, looked at the proficiency in mathematics and writing so far as some of the students that would perhaps be coming into our new school system. We found that about 25% of the students in the elementary, middle school level were below, 25% were at, I should say, proficiency in math as well as writing. And so far as at the high school level, only 10% of the students were at the proficiency level in writing for the state, and 0% were proficient in mathematics. We also had to go before our board to talk about what schools should be part of the school district. We had 38 to choose from within the city of Detroit, and approximately 98 to choose from across the state of Michigan. We chose 15 of the lowest of the low schools, and basically they were approved by our board of directors. We also, because we were operating what people called a low-performing school district, people often chastised me even for even taking a position with the EA, but also, how are you going to get students to come into that school district? Why would I want to put my child in what is considered a low-performing school district? So we had to counter the public perception. And we did that through a series of parent meetings. We went to every school that was assigned to us, all 15, and made sure that the parents in the community knew what this new school model would look like. We also did a multimedia blitz so far as print media, which some of you have right there today. We also did radio and television, making sure people understood the significance of not an underperforming school district, but what we basically want a school district to look like to help them toward the 21st century education. We also had what is called a door-to-door campaign, just like running for a political office, basically going door-to-door saying, this is what the school district looks like, this is what we want to do, and basically answer questions from anybody that answered their door and any child that was in that particular household. And then lastly, we had what is called a citywide education fun day, where on August the 4th, exactly 1 month before schools opened, had all 15 schools open to make sure that people understood and the significance of what was going to happen in that school, but also to meet the principals, meet the teachers, and just have basically a fun day in and outside of that school. So in the midst of that, we partnered with Harvard University Graduate School of Education to select our principals. All principals that applied had to go through what is called an online course and do an interview online as well. There were 647 principals that applied initially for 15 spots, and 247 principals were invited to basically take place in the online process. 34 principals were invited to come for a day-long interview process at our offices in Detroit. The first half of that interview was to take an underperforming school and show what you would do to make that a high-performing school. What would you do so far as implementation of curricula, so far as test preparation, teacher selection, things of that nature. And in the second half of the day, we basically looked at standard interview questions. From that, 13 principals were hired. We have 12 direct run schools. One school has a co-principal system. And then also we partnered with a charter school company called Performance Academies, and 3 of the principals were selected for those charter schools. In the midst of that as well, after principals were selected, we looked at our teachers and how we selected teachers. They also had to apply to an online process through Harvard University. They came in for what are called demonstration and selection days. They were interviewed by the principals because in this system, the principal hires the teacher, so they were able to view them as they did lesson plans and basically talk to them so far as in the interview process. And then eventually the teachers went through an entire month-long training so far as student-centered education, and this was held during the month of August. Then on the first day of school was Tuesday, September the 4th. It was a kickoff like none other. On that day, we had probably approximately 80% of our projected target enrollment by what is called Count Day in the state of Michigan. We had 10,282 students, which was 95% of our projected enrollment overall, so far as the direct run and charter schools, and 97% projected enrollment of just the direct schools alone. So in essence, when you look at the Education Achievement Authority of Michigan, it is a compilation of looking at best practices around the nation, listening to key stakeholders, including students within the state of Michigan, to make sure that we're on the cutting edge so far as a school district and taking students, parents, and families into the 21st century. As a motivational speaker once said, the person you are today is based on the decisions you made yesterday. And as we look at students today, and we think about them in traditional grades of kindergarten through 12th grade, and think about the decisions they're making, I take that to another level and say that the person they are tomorrow is based on decisions they make today. Thank you.
Before opening up to questions, I want to ask John White to overcome his natural modesty and say a couple things about New Orleans, in particular about the fact that the system there is moving toward all charters and no direct run, and also the way that the community is trying to build a marketplace of support providers for schools so there's not the need for a big centralized bureaucracy.
First, I want to say that Paul's characterization of me as modest calls into deep question his adequacy as a moderator on today's panel. But putting that aside, I'll make just 2 observations, and I'll just make my comments about New Orleans brief. And I should say at the outset that I've been there for a couple of years, but not for the majority of the story I'm about to tell. Number one, and I think this is the most important fact I'll share, but not necessarily the one that you'll take away entirely. In 2007, 23% of the kids in the Recovery School District in New Orleans were at basic and above. On the exact same test that when they took last year, 51% of kids were rated at basic or above. And I'll just say that by any indication I've seen statistically, the New Orleans turnaround story over that 5-year period represents the most radical improvement of an urban school system in America. But here's the thing that I think you'll probably take away with respect to the how, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we got there. The New Orleans system, as of September of 2013, will have 50 staff, and the New Orleans system centrally, and the New Orleans system operates on 1.75 cents on the dollar. And what I have learned between my time in New Orleans and New York is that you do not have local decision-making unless the money is used by local decision-makers. And when you look at whatever school system you work in today, and Lord knows, I worked in a district where we got nearly $20,000 per child, but where the system was effectively predetermined for kids by a set of contracts, rules, and regulations. And I need you to ask yourself, where is the money in your system? Because if it's not in the schools with people who are closest to the kids, the parents and the educators having control over the money, then I believe, frankly, the chances that are made on behalf of kids are very likely to not reach their ultimate potential. After Katrina, the state of Louisiana was able to apply a policy construct that already existed, which is the idea of the recovery school district, to 90% of the schools in New Orleans, which by all accounts, for any of you who had visited, and I had, was one of the worst, if not the worst, public school system in America, deplorable in all regards. And what that effectively did is not take over the school system, and I think that's where my story starts most importantly. It didn't take over the school system. You know, and I think, David, this was reflected in your story a little bit. When I taught in Jersey City, New Jersey, the state of New Jersey had taken over the Jersey City public school system. Well, lo and behold, when the Trenton bureaucracy takes over the Jersey City bureaucracy, you didn't have a miracle of learning. And what was so extraordinary about Leslie Jacobs and Paul Pastorak and a lot of the other folks in New Orleans, a small group of people, philanthropists like Sarah Houston, what they saw as not an opportunity to take over a bureaucracy and run a better bureaucracy was the chance to reconceive what government was to do, which is that government would simply place schools in a position of recovery. We wanted governance over your schools. We didn't want your bureaucracy. You keep your school board. You keep your, Title I office. We're just going to put your schools in a position of recovery. And so then the question is, what do you do with them when they're in that place of recovery? Well, New Orleans so ingeniously, and again, I give those people I mentioned and others extraordinary credit for this. They said, we're going to put 3 pillars in place in this system. Number 1, talent. As David said, and I cannot emphasize this enough, and Tyrone, you said this as well, is the recruitment of a large wave, development internally, recruitment externally, of talent. Educator talent is the bedrock. 2, accountability. We're going to place clear standards around accountability for what success looks like. And 3, governance. They chose a charter governance model where ultimately every school would become a charter school, meaning that every school would operate on more than 98 cents on the dollar locally. And that's all that really, if you look at it at the end of the day, that's really what a charter school is. It's a school where the principal has greater discretion, including over the dollars. The dollars are at the school. And so now what do you have? You have a system of nearly 100% charter schools, also about 5% private school vouchers. And in that system, you see the improvement that we have, but you also see that it's not just a school improvement or a school reform strategy, it's a government reform strategy. Because government, forced to operate on 1.75 cents on the dollar, has to ask itself, what is my responsibility? You know, there's nothing in the Louisiana State Constitution that says that government needs to run textbook procurement processes. There's nothing in our Constitution that says that government needs to bus every child, hire every teacher. It says that government needs to basically make sure there's an adequate education. And so in defining its role in New Orleans, government now does effectively 3 things. It distributes dollars, it enrolls kids equitably, and as Paul said, it closes and replaces bad schools. That's it. That's all the district does. Decision-making power is in the hands of those who are most local. Equity remains government's responsibility. Equitable dollar distribution, equitable access for kids, and equitable access to good schools, because we can't tolerate schools that don't make the grade. But other than that, academic, budgetary, curricular, human resources decisions on behalf of kids are made by the people who know and love those kids. It's not going to look like New Orleans everywhere, but I urge you to adhere to those principles. Happy to discuss it more and look forward to talking about it.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think we've got a good background. Glad to take questions or examples or whatever is available. Yes. Yes, please.
I'm Mike Flanagan. I'm State Superintendent of Schools in Michigan and work with Tyrone, and wanted to connect the dots that John and Tyrone made, because I'm not sure the audience, from something I heard in the back, is connecting. You don't necessarily need a legislature if you don't have a friendly one for reform to make some of this happen. In our case, what we did, the governor and I and a few others conceived of this EAA that Tyrone talked about, but it required, and it wasn't going to be passed at the time by the legislature. And since my favorite quote is, if you can keep your head when all about you others are losing theirs, maybe you don't understand the damn problem. The damn problem here in Michigan was out of 4,000 schools, 200 of them, 15 of which are with Tyrone right now, 2/3 of those have 0% of the kids proficient in either math or science or writing or reading. 0%, not one kid proficient in any of those areas. So where I'm going with this is connecting the dots. I wanted to just mention to the group, if you're with a place that just is not willing to change reform, and if you have, in this case, we've done some reforms, I was able to transfer and pass on some of my authority as state superintendent to that authority. And what ends up happening is there was some, because we had the authority to take over the lowest 5% performing schools, which are all over the state. So next year, for instance, in Tyrone's case, we started with Detroit, but there'll be other schools from around the state that are going to become part of this authority appropriately, more like the Louisiana model that John talked about. The key point I wanted to make was when we first were given this law a few years ago that gave the authority to me, we sat there and thought, how are we going to do this as a bureaucracy in Lansing? So this is where it conceived, and I would urge others of you that if you can't get it through legislation, there are other ways. Delegated the authority. I still have a role in deciding which schools go into that EAA, but then it's fully operational, fully up to John Covington and the team as to how they operate it. The money goes right there. It doesn't go to us under the way the law would have been constructed. So I encourage folks here to just be creative. It can't always work with, with particular House or Senate or governors that you might have in place. It sometimes can be stymied by a state chief also. But I think if you're willing to be creative, the kind of thing they're leading right now, and that's been led in Louisiana, is revolutionary. And these kids for 50 years have had no opportunities at all, and finally they're getting them, and I would just encourage everyone to find a way to do that in your state, whatever it takes.
Thank you.
If I may comment, yes, the EAA, the impetus for the EAA goes back to state legislation that was passed December of 2009, took effect on January 4, 2010, and it was 1280C of the revised school code that basically said that the state would operate the lowest 5% of the schools, and that law basically eventually was transferred to the EAA.
I'm Giselle Huff with the Jacqueline Newman Foundation. It's a question for Tyrone. You described a very interesting process to bring all the people together, the way you weeded out the principals and hired them and the teachers. And it's a very extensive process. It was quite far-reaching. I'm wondering where you got the funds for that. How did that fit into the picture? Did you have discretionary funds to do that? And if so, how did you make that work?
Well, because we didn't have any students at the time, so we didn't have a per pupil allowance, and that didn't come about until recently in October of this year. To basically start the EAA, there was a foundation that was generated called the Michigan Education Excellence Foundation, and this is where private donations or foundations gave toward what we call startup money. So with that startup money, we were able to hire our central staff and then basically do the marketing and do some of the things to get the EAA going.
Okay, thank you.
So just to comment, looking around the country, that in places where the portfolio idea is taking hold, local foundations as well as national ones are changing their orientation from helping run programs or services to building system change and capacity building. And you see the example Tyrone just gave in Michigan. In Cleveland, the Cleveland Foundation, the Gun Foundation, which were very much part of the clack for the school district for a long time, changed sides and built the basis for the portfolio district that then the mayor and the governor picked up. But that initiative started with private and grassroots level people. They didn't wait for state law. They created a mandate to get a state law.
Thank you. I'm Howard Stevenson, state legislator from Utah. As I look at what's happened in Louisiana and New Orleans, I think not all of us have the benefit of having a hurricane destroy everything so that we can start over. And whoever would have thought that Katrina would be the greatest blessing to the children of Louisiana or New Orleans at least. But the question, and I appreciate a lot of the things that have been described of how you get past the obstacles that are going in place. But I just wondered, do any of you have you changed the calendar model? Have you changed the expectation of student results so that we now expect every student to be proficient or advanced before you move on? We're not going to move you on by your born-on dates, but we're going to move you on by your achievement of proficiency. Anything in that realm? As you have the digital learning now, to empower individualized instruction to remediate. Are you able to do it that way rather than moving on a kid who got 73% instead of the level of proficiency?
Yes, and let me just make a couple of quick comments. First of all, congratulations to you for all of the academic and choice reforms that have gone on in Utah. Second, I would just say, and this is something I hope the group will take away, and I know you didn't exactly mean it this way, but I don't think the lesson from New Orleans is predicated on Katrina. I really believe it's about the courage and the prescience of a set of people who no doubt saw an opportunity, but really can be taken up in any instance. And it's a matter of there being good policy applied in very bold ways. And we're doing this, taking this concept and applying it in Baton Rouge, which is about 60 miles up the road, with a very, very entrenched bureaucracy and a very, very difficult environment with no external conditions to try to set it in motion. I'd say the same is true in Indianapolis and Detroit, although I know there's a wave of a cry for change in Detroit. I would say it's about courage and good policy making first and foremost. With respect to the question that you're calling out around credit granting on the academic side, we're moving toward a model of, of not seat time based, but of proficiency based performance, and we have, as I'm assuming other states do, promotion policies in place to gate kids or end of course assessments so that you can trust that those policies will actually not be abused. And I think that's the challenge that states are having to strike, is what's the right mix of summative assessments such that you can be confident that greater flexibility in terms of the use of time will actually be safeguarded. But let me also say this, I'm learning more day to day that the state's ability to say, okay, we're going to deregulate and create innovative conditions will mean almost nothing if you don't set the educators free to innovate and develop these models themselves. And there's so much lip service paid to this, but at the end of the day, what I'm seeing in our state is that the traditional districts, which is by far and away the most of them, have effectively control and command structures where people are drafted into leadership positions based not on their desire or ability to take risks, but based on their desire or ability to conform, and that ultimately innovation and kind of creative maladjustment is discouraged. And so until we have structural reforms of the kinds that we're talking about today and that Paul led with, irrespective of whatever good policy conditions exist around sophisticated things like proficiency-based credit rather than seat time-based credit, we're not going to see the models emerge in the way that we hope, because frankly, principals are scared to take risks and don't have the budgetary authority to do it in the first place. And let me highlight this by just sharing one more concept, and then I'll shut up. There's a school in the 9th Ward of New Orleans on St. Claude Avenue called Arise Academy. It's a charter school. It's in its 4th year. It's coming up for reauthorization this year. And I was meeting with the principal in April, and I said, what are you thinking about for next year? And to your point, he says, well, we're going to serve breakfast, lunch, and dinner to every school, every child in the school. This is a school. It's a pre-K through 8 school. And I said, well, not your 4-year-olds, surely. He said, no, we're going to do breakfast, lunch, and dinner, every one of those kids, 7 to 7. And I said, well, why are you, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm getting, every one of my parents wants it. A lot of my kids don't get it at home. And it gives me 2.5 hours extra learning time with every one of those kids. And he said, but here's the thing. The reason I can do it, and this is when I was the superintendent in New Orleans, is you don't run this school. Because if you ran this school as a superintendent, then the busing company would say, we don't do after 4. The unions would say, we certainly don't do after 4. Food would say, we don't do dinner and we only do lunch or breakfast for half the kids. And on down the line. Security would say, well, after time means comp time and all this stuff. At the end of the day, when we put that kind of authority in the hands of good leaders, and he's a good leader, they will arrive at the models that I think you're aspiring for us to arrive at.
Thank you.
And basically, in looking at the Education Achievement Authority, we also are looking at not movement based on seat time, but based on mastery. And students have individualized learning plans. And I can identify with this. When I sat in high school years ago, of course, the teacher basically taught to the whole. And you had some students that were ahead of that whole or below. And basically, some students just would get bored and basically act out in class and so forth. And others would basically be so advanced that they were bored as well. Well, with the Education Achievement Authority, we have students now, particularly our kindergarten through 9th grade, they're working in clusters, where one group of students may be at the smart board, another group may be on laptops and so forth. So the teacher is basically facilitating the education and not actually just standing teaching to an entire class. When we looked at the hours, we basically surmised that in Detroit, students were going to school approximately 1,098 hours per year, 170 to 180 days. We felt that was not enough as we looked at learning models around the entire world and looking at countries where students average 200 to 220 days a year. And we settled on a 210-day model. And as we interviewed, and I didn't talk about this earlier, 4,000 teachers, 4,000 teachers applied, 600 were interviewed. Of the 420 that were hired, we wanted to make sure that they basically could identify and could work with that model. All of them basically stepped up to the challenge, and currently we're underway so far as with the mastery individualized student-centered education.
Thank you. Chris Braunlick. I'm with the Thomas Jefferson Institute for Public Policy and also a member of the Virginia State Board of Education. My question's for Superintendent White. About 2 years ago, Louisiana passed something they call the Red Tape Reduction Act. And as I understand it, was designed to provide a great deal of flexibility to schools and school divisions in return for a tightening of accountability on the outcomes. I'm curious to what extent that has, and Kentucky, I understand, just passed something very similar. I'm curious to what extent that's been implemented, what its successes or failures might have been, and how you might have done that differently.
Well, I'd say a couple of lessons from that, and this goes to the gentleman's point, to Mike's point actually about state boards versus legislatures. And I thought that his point was, I don't know where he is, but was key on there. I thought your point, Mike, was key on this, which is that we underestimate, because it's not as, kind of bright in lights, the power of state boards of education. And it's different from state to state, and obviously you know this quite well, but a lot of the changes that I think can be made at a maybe more subtle policy level in a way that's a little more trenchant than just big, bold, we're wiping everything out, is at the board level. And so in part, I say that to say that the red tape waivers, which was a piece of legislation effectively saying that educators can apply to have any piece of regulation essentially eradicated for their purposes, I think hasn't entirely caught fire, because it was legislated and not done at the board level, where we can say, if we remove this, this is going to be the effect, this is going to be the effect. So it was maybe more of a legislative victory than it has been right now as a substance victory. But it's also to say that at the state board level, we're taking on, effectively removing a lot of those regulations that the waiver legislatively aspired to take out. And yet I still have concerns that even when you remove those regulations, or you shape them in a way that's more conducive to innovation, what's going to be the response if you don't have organizations governed in a way to stimulate innovation? And I can't say this enough, and it's not even about, kind of innovation for the purposes of policy making and that stuff, but just basic things. Extending the school day, extending the school year, giving more kids differentiated instruction, basic things that if we look at how we use textbooks, how we spend our money at the school level, how we staff, all of these things, if we just gave people in schools an ability to surface their ideas more than we do, I think we'd be in a better place to respond to those regulations. But I think our hands are tied right now because our leadership at multiple levels is not really viewing that as part of their job, to open up opportunities for creative, innovative people from the ground up. And until we get to that point, we're going to have a challenge.
Thank you. Will Krebs, Indiana Department of Education. Thank you all for the work you've done on this issue. You've all emphasized the importance of talent, particularly at the building leader level. Mr. Winfrey, you addressed how in your system those leaders were selected. I'm curious if you or the rest of the panel could address what can be done to better prepare individuals to serve in those leadership positions, particularly when you start to think that those individuals who might be in the pipeline to be building principals may not have experience, nor may institutes of higher education, schools of education be prepared to teach issues that haven't been asked of principals before, such as managing a budget, making hiring and firing decisions, et cetera?
Well, first of all, professional development was very key for us as far as with the talent. And as I indicated, not only were our principals, our teachers trained for an entire month, but also our principals went through a rigorous professional development leading up to July 1st, which was their first day of hire. They came in on weekends, and they also had a 2-day workshop or program at the Michigan State University as well, where we basically did a lot of training so far as professional development. One thing that we did find in this process is that, yes, you can train so far as mastery and how to implement a certain curricula and how to do individualized differentiated instruction, but when you're working with, in our case, the lowest of the low, so to speak, in an urban city that has been challenged for years, and I'm a native Detroiter, so I've seen the rise and fall of the automobile industry and poverty and you name it and so forth, all the social ills, but you're also dealing with a complex set of social things that those students bring to those classrooms. And that's what we're facing right now, and that's where more professional development is needed. Because not only are you dealing with the educational disparity, but the psychological, sociological makeup of those students is just sometimes mind-boggling on a day-to-day basis. So again, professional development, making sure you train, making sure there's a rigorous selection process, but also a significant amount of professional development, whether it's educational as well as social and psychological as well.
And just one point to add to that, that we think is most important is creating the conditions that attract the kind of talent that we need to really transform our schools. So training is one thing, but you need to create the conditions in schools that attract the caliber of talent that we want, and those are the kinds of conditions that John has so articulately described, where building level leadership really has the authority to determine not only what happens in the school building, but how their dollars and resources are allocated.
Let me just say that, first of all, I totally echo that, and I would apply that to maybe almost every previous comment, that the regulatory stuff is great, but until we create conditions that good people want to work in, these things don't change. Let me totally contradict that point by saying that the state, I think, does have a small role in answering your question. And I think we need to, when we think about human capital reforms, start understanding the right roles and responsibilities. I believe that the role of performance managing, and I'd be curious, David, about your experience in Indianapolis, when you talk about developing people for leadership jobs, I don't think the state should be running a bunch of programs to develop people for leadership jobs. The idea that we in Baton Rouge are going to be somehow good at running a training program for folks in Shreveport or anywhere else, that's just a joke. Local people need to do that. However, the state is in any state, is a good, blunt arbiter of when someone should have the license to do something and when they shouldn't, to drive, to operate a liquor store, to run a restaurant, whatever it is. I believe the same is true of school leadership. And I think if you look at your state, my guess is, I could be wrong, but certainly in our state, that what is required to be a school leader in your state is probably overly permissive and probably not aligned with student learning. And I do think that one of the advantages of now having more robust performance management systems and good data on educator effectiveness is that we will all now begin to ask, what at a state level, with our regulatory authority, should we start to do with those data? And I think one of them is to say, if you're going to be an effective leader of educators, you should have been an effective educator in quantifiable terms. So it's not all of the puzzle, but a part of it is the state playing its right role from a regulatory perspective.
And if I can go back, and John, just to echo your point again, that is very important. Going back, looking at the EAA, there are 18 people at the central level. And basically, we have pushed 90% of the resources, 90% plus of the resources to the schools. So not only did those principals not only have to be great educators, but they had to be great leaders and great managers, because they are the CEO in those buildings. They make decisions at the school local level, although at the central level we still make some of the structural decisions that need to be made in any school district. But the training and also the leadership capability of those principals is extremely important, and also for the teachers. Our thing also, when we look at teachers and administrators and whomever in the EAA, it's about growth. We want them not only to look at the position they're in, but how can they grow to the next level as well. So our leadership system is bar none, is one of the greatest. One thing we're looking at too, so far as our principals and so far as our administrators, is a leadership cohort where principals and leaders receive a PhD and an MBA, and we're looking at starting that at one of the local universities in the state of Michigan.
Just one comment about the future of school leadership. If you think about the logical extension of what's already happened in portfolio districts, we're going to be experimenting with different forms of schooling. Hybrid schooling, where kids are taking a lot of their work online. The work of the teachers is going to be changed because they're going to do enrichment and coordinate their work with what students learn online. There may even be schools in which students do a lot of the work outside of the school, come back in. So that the function of the leader in that new kind of school is going to be different from the leader in a totally high-touch school. And we need to figure out a way to set boundaries to prevent really abusive situations, but be open to kinds of leadership we don't know about today if the kinds of schooling changes. And that really, it goes back to, I feel as a university person I can say this, that the way principals are now selected and trained is incredibly perverse, because the smartest teachers and the most natural leaders often look at the coursework they have to do to become principals and think, I'm not going to go through that stuff. And in order to get the best people in the leadership jobs, we have to shortcut that and get to people who are natural leaders and help them get the training and experience they need. But also we need to be in a position of taking some risks about what school leadership is, because if we don't do that, we're not going to get innovation.
And I think one of the things that's interesting right now is maybe the people who are doing this training future leaders the best are the entrepreneurs themselves who've started great schools, who recognize that if they want to replicate their schools, they're going to need to cultivate great leaders, and they know what's required for success in their schools, and they're the ones that are going out, finding the leaders, training them, and preparing them to launch new schools within their networks.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you. My name is Randy Saragucci, and I'm a legislative analyst with Students First. And my first question is to the moderator. May I ask 2 questions?
You may, and I'll have you quick answers.
Okay, cool. Well, the first is both are generally to the panel. The first is curious about your thoughts on the effects of categoricals and the special interest support behind those, and class size caps in the law on district spending flexibility. And my second question is also for your thoughts generally on other mechanisms for effective enforcement of any accountability standards we're talking about. And the only example I could think of where there might be some issues is if a school were to close down because they did not meet those standards, who decides ultimately where the kids go, especially if it's a low-income area and those kids aren't able to go to the private school in their neighborhood?
Should I do a quick job and see if you, so categorical programs, by reducing the control the principal has and the accountability of regular classroom teachers are a problem. My own view is that that the money in those programs should become weights on student funding and be available to the school without any requirement that a program be kept separate. And then basically the school's job is to perform with those kids, and if it doesn't, then it's susceptible to being replaced. Class size caps, arbitrary, not based on evidence, have to be unproductive. Schools need to be able to decide what's the right class size for a given set of students and a given teacher. And I can't see what they do. And then finally, if you're serious about performance accountability, then it has to be performance accountability. It has to be about whether the students are learning. Schools that admit students who have weights because they are disadvantaged, they should get more resources and have freedom to use those resources. But whether they can actually use them effectively is the question that determines whether the school itself continues or not. Is that a lot in a short time? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Chris Robertson. I'm a glutton for punishment because I'm not only a state legislator in the state of New Hampshire, I'm also on the local school board. And you've been talking about, and you're talking about being big cities, and I think you have a lot in common. In Keene, we just found out that over 60% of our high school students made the honor roll, but only about 30% up past the NECAPS testing become proficient. Well, when I did look into the numbers, almost every single one that made the honor roll was white middle class, and the ones who didn't make the honor roll are the lower income and students of color. And we're also in a situation that we have to close down some schools because we've lost about 600 kids over the last 10 years. And it is unbelievable, maybe it's not, of the economic discrimination. Racial discrimination is no longer there. It's economic discrimination where parents are coming, I don't want my kids going to school with those kids. They're not kids, they're those kids. And And you have the low-income families, and you have the minority families who demand higher quality education for their children, but they're not getting on the honor roll. They're viewed as, quote, not competitive. And so how do you go and get to the point to engage the lower economic group and to really start a revolution in saying you're economically discriminating against our kids because based on income and based on where we're living in this town? Because if you don't, our children will never have a chance to succeed, like Governor Bush said this morning, because you already said they're failures.
Well, first of all, thank you for raising the issue regarding the distinction between big cities like New Orleans and Detroit and Indianapolis and everyone else. Most kids don't live in a big city district. They might live in a suburb of a big city or a rural environment, but they don't necessarily live in that big city. And I think we as a movement haven't done enough to address the needs of outer ring suburbs and rural environments. And I'm just coming to learn about these challenges in my current job, but we certainly have them. I guess, to be blunt about it, I think that you have to make a decision about how much faith one wants to put in the institution reforming itself versus how much faith you want to put in the ability of outside actors to try to reform the institution. I don't think it's an either-or. I think too often it's positioned as an either-or. I think you can be a credible standard bearer for public education and at the same time say that you're for any means necessary for a low-income parent to get what he or she deserves for her child. And that in the end, I believe, public education will be better for low-income parents in particular, having greater purchasing power over what their child needs and deserves. But I have little hope that after generations of not serving the needs of its most disadvantaged citizenry, overnight someone's going to wake up and just say, well, I'm going to do my job completely differently. I just don't think that's likely to happen in most cases. It's nothing against them. It's just unlikely to happen, I think. So thus, I would say that by all means necessary is the course that we're obligated to pursue, which means that if it means creating traditional or charter public schools that are outside of the ones that currently exist, let's do that. If it means creating private school options for kids that are publicly funded, let's do that. If it means creating even what we've created in Louisiana, which is choice at the course level, which is the ability of a parent to actually say, I want to send my child to college early. I want to send my child to a career course early. I want to take an online course early. Out of parish, in parish, what have you. I can do that with my dollars. We have tried to open up our funding formula as much as possible to the power of the parent to choose what is right for their child. And in the end, I think that's how we're going to develop good, innovative models that figure out how we serve low-income kids well at scale in the first place. But I don't think, and I don't see how this can be argued with, that by continuing to funnel $10,000 per year into the hands of institutions, per child, in the hands of institutions that have yet to serve those children, we hope that we're going to see something different in September from what we saw in May before. And we can sit around and we can play, a lot of platitudes to that idea, but at the end of the day, until there is the policy courage to literally put purchasing power in the hands of parents, I don't think you change the equation.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes for 2 questions.
Just
Go ahead.
a very quick comment. Your point about parents who don't want to send their kids to schools with certain kinds of kids, I think is a powerful one and one that I think we need to wrestle with. But there are schools in Indianapolis, and there aren't very many, that are truly economically, racially, and ethnically integrated. And the way they get there is they have school leadership that's committed to making sure that those schools are economically, racially, and ethnically integrated and diverse. But the bottom line is those schools are excellent schools. They're schools that any parent, no matter what kind of options they have, would want to send their kids to. So if we're going to create the kinds of conditions where we bring our communities together in our schools, the bottom line has to be that we create schools that parents, no matter what kind of economic situation they have, would be willing to send their kids to. We need to raise the bar of our schools if we're going to address that problem.
Thank you.
Well, first, let me thank you all for being here and sharing your wisdom and your insight to all of us. My name is Janet Adkins. I serve in the Florida legislature, and I'm struck by the comment that we need real structural reforms. And so in Florida, we have all of our school districts that many of our superintendents are elected. We have mostly elected school boards. And it's the superintendents who decide whether or not they've got district-based budgeting or school-based budgeting. And so I'm wondering if what you're advocating here is if we change that statute, that would basically require those school superintendents to have school-based budgeting and turn more of the decisions over to the principals? And then how would that integrate with, a lot of the union and the collective bargaining requirements?
I think every state is different, and in terms of what for example, your flexibility is on those contracts, I wouldn't want to make a recommendation per se, not fully understanding that. However, I would say that by and large, when you're making what are ultimately block grants to districts, we have every bit of evidence to show that districts, and this is, again, not blaming anybody, it just is what it is, they tend not to take those weights and spend them in a way where, as Paul was saying, the resources that are disproportionately large for a disproportionately disadvantaged child truly follow that child to the school site. We just know that doesn't really happen. They use the block grant in a way that tends not to serve those needs, and thus I would suggest that yes, whatever we do, we should try to get dollars to the school site in a way that is proportionate to the challenge of the students. And at the same time, I would suggest that it shouldn't just be budgetary authority. I would suggest we do everything we can around curricular authority, around hiring and firing authority, and that we see all of these things as a reaction to what we have in our country, which is an abnormally fragmented system. And I think this is what we're talking about with Tyrone and David and what we're doing in New Orleans. What the conditions that we're trying to create of a central ministry that operates lean regulatory authority and then site-based decision-making is not abnormal around the world. It's the norm in effective countries around the world. Right. And our opponents have somehow positioned it as a privatizing, outlying situation when in fact it's a best practice. It's our overly fragmented system that is itself the outlier globally. And when we look at successful systems, they tend more to look like what we're talking about here. There's a reason why when you walk into an American public school, what you're greeted with is 20 clerical staff who have nothing to do with student achievement, but when you walk into a school in Finland, that's not the case. And the comparison is not an entirely a fair one, but the comparison on that is. So I would say that whatever we need to do to get dollars as well as other decision-making authorities in the hands of people who are closest to the kids, we should by and large do it.
Thank you. Last question.
I didn't think we had time for another one, but I'll go fast. And no one's mentioned this, but I'm just wondering, with all these innovations, today so much of the parents' focus is not on academics, it's on athletics. It's a wrong focus. It's probably driven because we have competition in athletics. We don't have competition, in the classroom, and so it's one place they think they can have an impact. But how do these reforms affect the athletic program? What have you seen? Are there problems that can be created with the changes that we're talking about?
When we look at athletics, and that's part of my role as chief of staff is over the athletic program as well with the EAA, we decided to stay within the Detroit Public Schools league. We talked to the Michigan High School Athletic Association, so we stay within that league. But one thing about it, when you talk about site-based management and you talk about CEOs having accountability, now we have that same type of accountability with our athletic directors and our coaches. So it's not a structure where basically we tell you what just to do, but they basically are having more decision-making power. We have found within our 2 to 3 month period that has gone well so far as the athletic program, and I don't know what's going on in Louisiana, but with our Education Achievement Authority, it's going well with our site-based management along with the athletic program.
Just to go back to something John said early, the essence of this kind of reform is that government keeps a very few functions, and one of them is performance oversight. And what happens in portfolio districts is schools that people are affectionate for are shown to be ineffective and can be put under pressure and can sometimes close. And that leads to upset in communities because the essential communication between the government and the people in the school is, we've been letting your kids go to a school that's killing them and so have you, and we have to stop it. This leads to resentment, and it can lead to issues like what about the Trappers, what about our great baseball team? But actually those things become swept away by the overarching focus on achievement. Obviously, there are smart ways to maintain kids' opportunities to play ball by creating clubs instead of located at schools and so on. But the idea that a effective sports team or sentiment for a sports team would be the reason you keep a school that's not effective doesn't fit in this framework. Thank you. Did Okay, we've actually not only had a good discussion, but ended on time, and the governor will not come and get us. Thank you all, and I hope that we can pursue this next time. This is an evolving framework for redefining government that it is just begun. We can talk a lot about all the issues that we've just encountered in the last year, about, for example, how to create industrial self-regulation so that charter school systems serve special ed kids, so that schools that have an opportunity to be free riders on those issues are not. These are all kinds of big issues that come up, but they're essential to be solved not by regulation, but by private initiative, and I think we're seeing it done. Thank you.